Following upon our treatment of landscape last week, we continue by looking at British landscape, a very different approach, given that Britain, much like Venice, had a very different association and relationship with the sea. Now, by the mid-19th century, landscape will become one of the most popular genres in the art world. It is even taught in academies, where it was previously looked down upon. It does not have the prestige still of history painting, but the popularity cannot be denied. In Georgian Britain, we see a dramatic rise in landscape with the naturalist movement, which began with regional tourism and nationalism and encouraged people to enjoy the wonders and beauty of the countryside in Britain. Therefore, human emotions are going to be brought together and align with nature's moods as they understood it. Now, the French Revolution of 1789 effectively ended the Grand Tour for British aristocrats and those traveling south, so they had to go elsewhere. So tourists were redirected instead to the south coast of England and the Lake District in northwest Scotland. So we find that these areas become the most commonly traveled to in replace of the Grand Tour. And so the themes that are going to be seen in art shift from classical antiquity, statuary, and painting, instead turning to the wonders of the natural environment, much like we saw in Germany. Now, there are limited cultural riches in England, to be sure, because, of course, the Romans occupied the country relatively late and not nearly as long as other areas of Europe. But it did have immense natural beauty. Now, there were large areas in Britain that were claimed by industry, that were choked by coal mines, textile mills, lime kilns, and forges. But there were other unspoiled areas as well. Now, people like William Blake, in essence, regretted the loss of pastoral England and actually referred to the industrialization and the structures that went along with them as dark satanic mills. Therefore, we see the shift now from culture to nature in England, where travel became a solitary activity, whereby one would reflect on their life in a process of self-discovery, much like the Rückenfigure that we talked about in Germany. Thus, this increases. At the same time, we see more pastime available thanks to industrialization among the middle class. So a broader swath of the population are taking advantage of this travel. There also was a new vocabulary that is needed to describe these destinations in guidebooks for tourists. New terms like beautiful, sublime, and now we add the third, picturesque, or something that is like a picture. This also corresponded with new gardening designs in England beginning around industrialization in the 1720s, which were opposite of those in France, or otherwise known as French gardens, as seen at Versailles. The French garden style seen here was one that was to retain a strict geometric plan and order that was clearly bounded and controlled nature. On the other hand, the English garden became irregular in its layout from nature, with winding paths, irregular ponds, and clumps of trees, as seen here with the garden at Storehead. Now, these gardens were not naturally grown in this fashion. They were designed by people like Henry Hoare II, who had several picturesque views stationed throughout the garden itself, such as a structure intended to mimic the appearance of the Pantheon and to imitate the effects of Claude Lorrand's landscapes that were especially popular in Britain in the 18th century, seen here in the upper left-hand corner. So unbridled, unkempt nature and a type of ancient structure together were seen as the ideal picturesque elements. Now, William Gilpin is going to be a schoolmaster and printmaker and was the first to write a book on these picturesque elements and to produce a guidebook showing people where to go and what to do. So we find here that he related the British countryside to landscape artists like Laurent, Roysdale, and Rosa. And the picturesque he is going to locate somewhere between the sublime and the beautiful, whereby he would favor ruins as a favorite motif, which he would call the consequence to the scene, reminding us of the ravages of time. This led to a picturesque craze, with artists trying to find the best position to sketch ruins. Here we find the type of satire and public image as people fall into water trying to get the perfect position down. Now, Gilpin encouraged, in his 3 essays of 1792, travelers to sketch and watercolor. Therefore, this is perfect for fleeting atmospheric effects. Here we find that watercolors were popular with amateurs and professionals, but snubbed by the Royal Academy. There were clubs that organized their own shows, such as the Royal Watercolor Society in 1804. Thomas Girton is going to be one of these watercolorists who's quite important, and he will show that the medium could rival even oil painting, though he died relatively young at the age of 27. He began his career as a topographical artist, drawing popular tourist sites to illustrate travel guides. In essence, he would bring together the topographical landscape tradition and that of the picturesque. Here, with his Guisborough Priory of 1802, Girton is going to show us in a watercolor that looks very much like an oil painting, a Gothic ruin against a landscape. And it is topographical in that it records what this actually looks like, but he frames it in such a way and at an angle to make it picturesque. We have both a type of scenery combined with a dramatic angled composition, with strong lighting and dark contrast and irregular surface textures. Here we find that we are recording a moment, but also alongside this romantic landscape tradition, whereby we have a ruin framed by these trees, shown at a diagonal, and once again with dramatic lighting. Now in Bomberg Castle, Northumberland, we have another example of such a picturesque site in watercolor again. Here, if we combine them, we have a different mode showing us the sublime rather than the picturesque, something that is foreboding and fear-inducing, with this castle that is dark and a storm behind it. Off in the distance, we see the ocean, multiple threatening elements brought together. And so we can see the different types of styles that existed side by side at the time. The interest in the sublime was going to be from Cozens, who traveled widely in Switzerland and Italy. As you can see here, John Robert Cozens' Lake Albano and the castle Gondolfo here is going to be another watercolor and in the same type of picturesque tradition. Now, if we are to look at the size and scale of the figures here by Girton, you can see how the structure dwarfs the human figures, emphasizing the colossal size of the castle, much as we saw with Piranese's more romantic approach to Roman architecture, to communicate the emotional effect and not necessarily what it looked like. Now here we do have a Dutch Baroque precedent with Ruysdael, and certainly Girton and other landscape artists were very aware of this Dutch painter, who also showcased crumbling older structures, dramatic scenes, nature that is unkempt, taking over human elements with dramatic atmospheres. Turning now to perhaps the best-known British landscape painter, we have Joseph Mallord William Turner, better known as J.M.W. Turner. He once again began as a watercolorist, or practicing a lesser art, and turned then to oils to be more respected in the Royal Academy. He was an academician in 1802 and a professor of perspective in the Academy proper from 1807 to 37. Now, he sought to raise the status of landscape to that of history painting with two specific steps. First, he sought to emulate the old masters, specifically Ruysdael and Laurent. Second, he sought to imbue these landscapes with narrative and allegorical elements. So if we look early in his career, with Salisbury Cathedral seen from cloister. We have, much like Girton, topographical accuracy with a dramatic composition. He uses scale with the small diminutive human boy-like figure in the foreground to the right, set against the massive crumbling structures of this cloister, to give the impression and to frame this massive cathedral here at Salisbury. Now this exaggerated the scale and has a very dramatic impact and picturesque quality to it. It is not this big, just as Piranese's interpretation of aqueducts were not that big. But the effect is what matters. This can be compared exactly to Girton in that he also was a watercolorist and is also going to combine these two elements of topographical accuracy and picturesque qualities. As we can see here, Turner, like Girton, is going to be emphasizing the crumbling nature of the older structure, in this case a Gothic one. And that was very appreciated in England at the time, as the Gothic revival is coming back here. Turning now to the decline of the Carthaginian Empire of 1817, we can see a history painting, but set here as a landscape. Now we know that Turner, even though he could do picturesque elements, preferred the sublime and the ideal instead. So here he took his formula from Claude Lorrain, with a body of water flanked by unequal groupings of buildings on either side, bathed in a warm light. In this instance, he is imagining and rendering Carthage off the African coast, described by Virgil in the Aeneid, where Queen Dido of Tyre is going to be on the left bank, fleeing the country after her husband is murdered, and she will then found Carthage. So this is intended for an audience who is well versed in the classics. The left bank, as you can see here, is very active, representing hope, the rise of a new city, whereas the right bank is going to be shown with deserted elements, a tomb relating to Dido's husband, the past tragedies that have befallen this empire, but foretelling also the annihilation by the Romans in the Punic Wars, as they will defeat Carthage. Another one of these dramatic elements of the sublime can be seen in his shipwreck here of 1805. In this, we see that the sublime elements showcase the immense powers of nature, with a sailboat capsizing as the crew abandons ship to its fate. Now this falls in line with the tradition of Dutch marine painting, which often showcased man's insignificance in the face of the very powers of nature and the sea, the fragility of human life, and the vanity of human endeavor, that there's nothing really we can do in the face of such godlike power. Certainly the same can be said of a massive painting here, of 4 feet by 7 feet, of the snowstorm, which is actually a history painting, if you look very carefully, of Hannibal crossing the Alps. Now Hannibal was a general of Carthage during the Punic Wars, and he was caught in a snowstorm while he was attempting to invade Italy. This was inspired by a trip to Switzerland that Turner had made in 1802, as well as the recent invasion by Napoleon in 1800, as he also crossed the Alps and compared himself to Hannibal. So this was submitted to the Royal Academy exhibition, with a poem condemning Napoleon as the new Hannibal for wasting lives in a futile attempt to conquer Rome. This would, of course, have been sympathetic to the British, as they were going to be facing off against Napoleon soon. The sublime nature here can be seen as nature overpowers man's endeavors. We have the huge snowstorm above, blotting out the sun in the upper left-hand corner. We cannot see 2 feet in front of our faces, as the armies below are going to be drenched in this apocalyptic scene, much as though you would see if you were in a snowstorm yourself. Therefore, minuscule figures are going to be overpowered by nature, but it is still a narrative, it is still a history painting. But he's moving further and further away from something that is descriptive into an element that is going to be much more expressive. Now turning to J.M.W. Turner, or Joseph Maillard William Turner, we have an artist who is a precursor to the Impressionists, who almost virtually frees the brushstroke from its mimetic responsibility, its descriptive responsibility. Here in his Slave Ship of 1840, you have a great example of that fear of the sublime noted by Edmund Burke, where if you were not looking carefully enough, you would not notice the ship in this sunset scene with the torrential waves thrashing about in the foreground as the sun reflects off of them, almost as though it is on fire. The ship is going to be in the midground left, barely visible and highlighted, backlit against the horizon. In the foreground, we have a series of shackled hands and fish that are feasting upon the flesh of these dead and dying slaves. The episode is going to be taken from recent British history and is a commentary of abolitionist movements, that being an argument to end the slave trade, whereby you see these slaves torn apart here as they drown, shackled, without the ability to even swim to safety. The episode comes from a famous book, Thomas Clarkson's The History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade from 1783. In the book, we find that slavery is abolished in Britain in 1807, but is still practiced because it is illegal in other countries such as America. Now, this is going to highlight man's inhumanity to man, and an episode that takes place whereby a ship captain is going to realize in his insurance plan that the slaves that die en route to a destination, say of dysentery or disease, he will not be reimbursed for. But if these same slaves die being lost overboard, he can write them off as a loss. So you find that this slave trader very cruelly throws individuals that he believes will die before reaching their destination of a slave market overboard to drown, instead of losing the money otherwise as a loss. Now, the technique used to communicate this horrific scene is actually quite innovative in that we have the palette knife used to scrape onto the surface instead of the brush. And he can see this impasto technique here as you layer very thick, unblended paint one over another. A very effective representation for the bright sun over the horizon. So this is going to be done, if you're unfamiliar with painting, by way of mixing paint, which is what a palette knife is meant to do, is to blend paint together to create different colors. But instead of then taking that paint with a brush, you take the actual blending knife, the palette knife, and scrape it directly on the surface. Therefore, we're going to get a technique that is increasingly loose and suggestive, that moves us towards this notion of pictorial freedom and illustrates the sublime, as with Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea here, whereby we're going to see this notion of a terrifying, overwhelming scene, in this case of humans being violently murdered and drowned and eaten and torn apart by fish. A horrific scene, but we are safe from it, witnessing this event, and thus we're supposed to take from this event our rage and our incredible disbelief that this could have possibly occurred, and pressure politicians to finally end the slave trade. The examples seen in the shipwreck scenes and the snowstorms are going to come to a culmination in Turner's late works of the 1840s that certainly represent the sublime, here reducing landscape to water, light, and atmosphere on the verge of 20th century non-objective painting. Here we have his Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, produced in 1844. In it, we are asked to question what exactly is the subject, which is supposedly given the title A Railway and a Train, seen here in the right-hand middle of the composition, barreling towards us across the bridge at a diagonal. The effect, of course, is showcasing the power of this locomotive in very abstract terms. Here, if we have a detail, you can see that impasto technique that Turner develops over his career, in that the train is a series of abstract shapes, with a chimney for the smoke here, and the front, and then the wheels that are suggestive of the track and what is going to be barreling down it. Everything else, though, are merely blotches of paint. So we're capturing the effects of atmosphere and movement, as the subject in this example is secondary. Now, to do this, he thinned his oil paint like you would watercolor washes, and then on top of that painted very heavy impasto, two completely opposing techniques, one gentle and elemental, the other one heavy and solid. So here we have the shift between viewing the representation of a shipwreck or of a locomotive and the canvas itself covered in paint. So we're expressing the tangible atmospheric effects that one would have here over what it's actually showing. So the work is going to be shown even as he would produce these paintings. He would work on these paintings and hang them in an exhibition in the Royal Academy. And an eager public would come to see his technique of how he would work to create these, much as he would showcase this for public audiences. Now here we have the Maidenhead Bridge that was recently constructed in 1806, finished in 1859. So its broad arches were unprecedented. So you're looking at a modern marvel of technology that is very difficult to suggest motion in a steel painting, but he was able to do it. So instead of showing the bridge, as seen here in the lithograph in the lower right, instead of showing the bridge perpendicular to the picture plane, running across it in a horizontal fashion, he turns the viewing angle at a diagonal so as the bridge itself and the train speed towards us to give us the effect, not to show us how the bridge was constructed, but to showcase the speed that it allows. So now we have this radical perspective of foreshortening. And to show us how fast this train is, we have a hare, a rabbit, running out in front of it, the fastest animal. So this is going faster. Finally, let's turn to John Constable, the son of a wealthy miller. He resisted his son's ambition to become an artist and eventually relented, admitting him to the Academy in 1799. Now, he is the other great 19th century landscapist along with Turner, but he was entirely different. Whereas Turner had an extensive range of landscape subjects and traveled widely, Constable represents a purely British artist who stayed close to home, painting the countryside in East Anglia or the northeast of London, bordering the North Sea. He wanted to emulate the great masters and create landscapes of historical significance, rendering the landscape naturalistically, not in a picturesque fashion like Turner and Girton. However, both of them wished to elevate landscape in the Academy and raise it within the hierarchy of genres, to be equivalent to history painting. Here with the Haywain, we have one of his most famous paintings and a good representation of Constable's work from 1821. In it, you have a clear representation of an idyllic scene with people crossing or fording a river, with a dog on the bank nearest us, a cottage to the left, moving off into a gentle opening in a meadow. It is believable, this scene, rather than sublime or picturesque. We believe this place exists. Therefore, we have a pastoral landscape, one that is akin to how we would interpret the landscape surrounding London. It is also large scale, thus it raises the respect for this type of image. Now, the appearance here that is straightforward and bucolic gives him the title natural painter, versus Girton and others who would show these semi-romantic compositions, usually at angles with something towering over us, with dramatic lighting. Instead, Constable shows us something that is going to be bucolic and that is something those living in cities wish they could see. because it is also fictionalized, and it is nostalgic in its reconstruction of what the countryside is. When exhibited, for instance, in 1821, the farmers were rioting, destroying property. We have a fall in agricultural prices. So we do not have an idyllic countryside. Instead, we have smog and smoke choking, once again, individuals with these factories. So it is not truthful, but it is instead aimed at recovering his youth and the conservative middle class that regretted passing of the good old days with naturalism versus realism. So trying to show how they wish things were as they recalled it in the distant past. So here he would retain these naturalistic effects, however, by making studies in oil on site. Now, not only did he do sketches like other artists, he made these studies so that he could see what the effects of the clouds would look like. Now, remember, at this time, there are no paints to store in tubes. Therefore, he had to store them in pig bladders to transport them. But it is important because then he could achieve accurate meteorological effects like the cirrus cloud study here. So if we compare the two, we have very different approaches. Turner seems to be much more influential if we look at modern art of the 20th century. But when the Haywain was exhibited in Paris in 1824, it was copied by people like Delacroix and became a model for the Impressionists. So in a sense, both were equally significant. Now, prepare by reviewing the study guide and midterm review slides for the exam coming up, and be sure to reach out with any questions.